Hello, this talk is on the debate on YouTube between British Army versus American Army ethos, doctrine, training, and culture. Now, it's widely seen from the British perspective that the American Army is not at the same standard as the British Army, but that's all from the US Marines certainly do not believe the US Army is of the same training as the United States Marines. From the people I've talked to on YouTube about it, and from my own a bit short military involvement in the para reserve. And also from speaking to veterans from Afghanistan. Some of my friends, some people who I've spoken to on YouTube. There is definitely a clear difference in the ethos of how Americans and how British people who serve in the military see war. Now, I would argue that the American military, rather than choosing to produce professional soldiers, are trying to produce warriors. This is clearly the case by the affirmation that Donald Rumsfeld rewrote, where it reinforced the idea that the Americans would use overwhelming firepower and numbers and technological means to overcome the enemy. So it's much more of a technical way of warfare rather than a human-led way of warfare. But the human part comes in strongly when Donald Rumsfeld started to talk about the American soldier getting to grips with the enemy as an individual and closing if need be to destroy that person at close combat. This can be clearly shown by the way the Americans conducted warfare during the Fallujah campaign, and also in Vietnam, and particularly in the Pacific. War was less personal and emotionally driven. The Americans were seeking to get revenge, and this has been a case throughout the beginning of their history. When the British soldiers massacred people protesting against higher taxes and lack of political freedom, the American Minutemen at Bunker Hill were taking revenge on the British. Against Indian massacres, people were raised as a levy to take revenge on the American Indians who did that, whether they be Mohawks or later the Sioux. Also, in 1812, when General Jackson first mobilised his men, he expected that they would be good at fieldcraft and shooting, and also good at marching, because of the rural nature of America then, and much more rural nature of America even today. Those three prerequisites are already considered so part of American culture that they are not really focused on as much as in the British Army, arguably. What is focused on is getting aggression and physical strength into the people. Now, the British Army in barracks is arguably as good as it is in the field, whereas the American Army in barracks is poor. That is one of the reasons for this, is the lack of PT that they do. Americans generally run 3 miles a day, 3 times a week. From the research that I've done and from people who have actually been in the American military, have told me. A US Marine even said that he was happy that he got down to 19-minute miles. This would be considered extremely poor in a British Army infantry regiment, where the standard is about 7 minute miles or 8 minute miles. And also generally people either run between 5 and 8 miles a day, every day. But taking the case of General Jackson, later in the battles, after losing to the British forces in 1812, their troops rapidly improved. Such was the case that the Americans usually, as do the British, usually lose the first battle, and then their forces increasingly adapt and get better. But thus, in the Second World War, it was for revenge from Pearl Harbor. But arguably, at the start of the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese understood this and thus didn't show any necessity for the Americans to take an emotional part in the war at the beginning. Later on, of course, the Americans were taking revenge for those battles. Now, when Iraq happened, there was obviously a need to link that with 9/11 for that reason, that they needed an emotional attachment to the war to get their blood up. Now, in the British Army and in the British society, we are not used to using firearms, but we are used to fighting. If you go to a British town or in any walk of life, we fight after football matches, that's soccer matches to Americans. We fight in nightclubs, we go to MMA, boxing is a big part of our culture. Rugby is like American football, a very aggressive sport. So there's not really any need to get the aggression of the British soldier up, but rather because we live mostly in cities, there's a big need for long marches to get fitness up and good field craft. The American soldier might say, death before dishonour. The British soldier's motto is check and check again. He doesn't want to close with the enemy, he wants to stay in good cover, take aim, destroy that target and then move on. To the British soldier, we do not fight for personal reasons. In all our wars, the head of state has been the reason, or organised crime in the case of Cecil Rhodes and other scum like him, have recruited British soldiers as either outright mercenaries or under the banner of the head of state. We should swear an oath of allegiance to democracy and a constitution, just like the American soldier does, but more we swear to uphold the head of state, where it was Cromwell during the English Civil War, the last English Civil War, or now the Queen. To get more deeper into fieldcraft, to the actual military doctrine, might require another vid, but we can say that even American US Marines believe that the British Army is more professional than the American Army. But then we might say the difference between the American Marines and the Royal Marines of Britain is particularly in their tasks. There is a limit to how many men and equipment you could get onto a ship and deploy. And America is a maritime power, but it is also a large land power, and it needs to deploy massive firepower in a very small space, as seen at Iwo Jima, and to deploy tanks and aircraft and all the rest of it. Royal Marines are much more on the verge of being special forces. If you take the idea that they have to do a 30-mile march in under 8 hours across Dartmoor with up to 45 kilos on their back, which is about 2.5 pounds to a kilo. So you do math, Americans. Then you see how difficult that is. There may be a part 2. See you then.